Hi, everyone. We are getting towards the end of the semester, and this is a discussion that I'm very proud that I could, put together. Dr. Krishnamurthy Sriramesh is present here on the discussion with us through Zoom. Thank you very much, Dr. Sriramesh. And I wanted to make a brief introduction about the professor. He has been appointed as a professor of public relations and faculty director of the professional master's program at the College of Communication, Media and Information of the University of Colorado Boulder. His extensive teaching experience includes teaching public relations at universities in Asia, Australasia, Europe, and North America. His teaching has been recognized with several awards, including Teacher of the Year at the University of Florida and Charles W. Redding Teaching Award at Purdue University. His research program covers topics such as strategic public relations, global public relations, corporate social responsibility, and public relations for development by nonprofits. He has co-edited several books and is just finishing the third edition of the Global Public Relations Handbook, Theory, Research, and Practice. He has published over 80 research articles and book chapters, in addition to presenting over 100 conference papers, seminars, and presentations in over 30 countries. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Sriramesh, for being present here at this discussion with my students in the Masters in Public Relations at the SIUE. And this is a course, an elective course in international public relations. So if it's okay with you, I would like to start with some questions that send directly to your overall, knowledge and preparation. What are some key characteristics, according to you, of public relations in the international settings? You know, if you could give us some examples of specificities in public relations in Asian settings, other regional settings that you have experience with, that you have noted in your research.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Professor Nastasia. I'm happy to be here with your students and yourself. As far as my introduction is concerned, I think the third edition of the Global PR Handbook is out. It has been out since November. So the bio that you read must be a little bit dated. So right. I don't know which edition your students are referring, because you said that they are using it for some of their projects, but I hope it's the third edition, because it is it came out in November of 2019. Yes, you have given me two key questions, and then of course you said the students would have some as well. 1 hour will not do justice in answering even the first question, let alone these two and the others. So let me combine the two questions that you had sent me by email, adding also how are characteristics of public relations impacted by culture, etc. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Global PR Handbook, you know that we talk about 5 environmental variables: the political system, the economic system, the media system, culture, as well as activism, as 5 variables that play a key role in the way public relations is practiced within nations, but also between nations and globally. So I think your first question kind of alludes to that. The thing is, I think I wrote way back in 2002 critiquing the CPRE's Port of Entry report in 1999, saying that the body of knowledge of public relations is quite ethnocentric, because it doesn't really incorporate, it didn't incorporate these various diversities. And that was in 1999, you know, we were on the threshold of entering the 21st century, the millennium of globalization, etc. And so it was ever more important for us to be aware of these differences among regions and countries and so on. So that was the reason why we came out with the first edition of the Global PR Handbook. Of course, we began work in 2001 and it was published in 2003. Having myself lived in various parts of the world, one of the first things that I saw when interacting with PR practitioners there is how the local culture played a key role in the way communication took place. And unfortunately, that is something that we have not even now taken a close look into. I don't think our field has done enough research to look at culture, again, broadly defined as we have done in the Global PR Handbook. And to just give a couple of examples, we have Xiu Ting from China. One of the things that I saw firsthand way back in 2005 when I was visiting Beijing was I met with the Secretary General of one of the non-profits there. And it was actually an umbrella organization, a non-profit of some 30 or so other non-profits. These were activist organizations. It was called CANGO, the Chinese Association of NGOs, non-government organizations. So now in the West, and most of the literature in public relations talks of, for example, activism as an adversarial relationship between those who are not happy with organizations, whether it's governments or corporations, and so they kind of rebel, they use various pressure tactics. But in a different political system, such as China, well, CANGO was involved, for example, in a campaign, unlike anything that we in the West would think of from an activist organization. So that campaign was called 26 Degrees Campaign. And essentially, Xiaoting, are you familiar with that campaign at all? The 26 Degrees Campaign. It was an environmental campaign where the focus of the campaign was in exhorting the citizens of China to raise the temperature setting on their thermostats to 26 degrees Celsius in the summer so as to reduce the consumption of electricity. Now, this was coming from an activist organization. So you can say that's an activist, an environmental activist group, a very laudable objective for a campaign, but it's very different than an activist campaign that we might think of in the West. So culture plays a role, and culture is also affected by the political ideology of the country, the media system, etc. So all of those 5 variables are interrelated, and they play a role in how campaigns take place. So that would be, I think, an example to kind of showcase how different regions deal with communication in different ways. And as I said before the recording began, interpersonal communication plays a key role in this. And each of us comes from a very different cultural setting. I think way back 20, 25 years ago, I made a remark that public relations, there is no such thing as international public relations as a specialty anymore. There is nothing called domestic public relations versus international public relations, because we are so mobile in this world. And so almost every communication, whether it is within national boundaries or outside of it, tends to be cross-cultural or intercultural, simply because of, look, in this one class, the diversity of cultures that is represented being such a small class, right? And I don't know the other students, but if you look at your roster, you'll see how diverse we are. So those diverse cultural experiences make us different communicators. And unfortunately, I think the body of knowledge has been very much focused on dealing with communication as if it's a one-size-fits-all approach with few, if any, nuances. So I hope I have kind of given a flavor for those 2 questions, Professor. Now, I know that there are quite a few, John said he has quite a few questions and so on. And I can always come back to this if there aren't enough questions from the class.
Sure, sure. Um, I'm just curious. Have you seen, American campaigns trying to promote not just something private, like a private business abroad, but international initiatives, or just promoting different regions for tourism in the United States somewhere abroad? Have you seen something like that?
Is your question, are there American organizations that are conducting campaigns in other parts of the world that are not marketing campaigns? Is that what you're getting at?
No, I'm trying to see if the government, as compared to marketing campaigns paid by private businesses, is trying to promote an image of America or touristic areas or something
Oh,
like that abroad.
got it. Oh, absolutely. I think every government does that, right? So every government is trying to showcase its country, its regions, so that tourists come. We have a whole body of knowledge called public diplomacy, right? So public diplomacy is essentially the focus, and international public relations plays a key role in it. The focus there is on soft power, that is using or leveraging on a country's natural resources in order to attract attention, not just tourists, but also support internationally.
Okay.
So that happens all the time. And we have information campaigns, not necessarily only marketing campaigns. And every country is engaged in it. And I think in the second edition of the Global PR Handbook, there is an entire chapter from my good friend, the late Michael Kunchik, on how developing countries, for example, have used communication campaigns in the developed world in order to increase their own profile and thereby increase the number of development dollars that flow into the developing countries. So that's, again, it goes very much along the lines of your question. So these are hardly marketing campaigns. These are essentially campaigns that are aimed at the images of nations.
Yes, but I was, maybe I should have specified this from the very beginning, but my question stems from the fact that I am always accustomed with examples of such campaigns done for American publics. But I have never seen a campaign from the United States somewhere in another country, let's say in India, let's say in China, because you see, for understanding the local culture, sometimes the United States has the advantage that already they threw their mark into that market, usually through movies, through fashion, through shows on TV. This kind of brand of America that is well known by everybody around the world. So already the perception of the local population is kind of opened into a positive way towards any kind of campaign coming from the United States. So I was wondering if you've seen or analyzed something like that. How are American entities promoting themselves in the rest of the world? And is it easier for them? Is it the same?
Well, unfortunately, the US government stopped the USIA, the United States Information Agency. Well, what was USIA all about for almost 50 years or so when it began? So it essentially used various mass communication tools, magazines, etc., to propagate American values. It had nothing to do with any marketing of any product and so on. So they were basically engaged in disseminating American values such as democracy, human rights, etc., which I think goes to the heart of your question.
Yes.
And I was myself, a consumer of that because my youth was, spent in India. And I still remember this magazine called SPAN, S-P-A-N. And I was an avid reader of SPAN, which came from the US Information Agency, USIA in Delhi. And it was free. You just had to express your interest, and they sent it. And it was something that I read. It was a monthly, as I recall. So Voice of America, right? So I think there are plenty of such examples, not to mention Hollywood, etc., which you already, identified as purveyors of Americanism, if you will, around the world. Look at the public affairs unit of the Pentagon. They actually work with Hollywood producers and production units and so on by giving them access, precisely for the reason that Hollywood is so pervasive around the world, and then American values can be portrayed that way also.
Have you observed these recent news that, the leadership of Voice of America, because you mentioned, was recently changed by the Trump administration? Do you think this will impact negatively how America is perceived in the future?
Well, I think it's a whole 3-hour program we can have on how America's, I guess, reputation around the world has been affected by the current administration through various ways. And I think this is another example of that. I certainly think that the US perception around the world on what America stands for has certainly changed drastically. This is something that we all know, and perhaps not for the better.
Yeah, I understand that the European Union, because of the news of second wave of infections in the United States, is considering not allowing, American travelers to come to the European Union.
Yes, that's the news from the past 2 days. And it may very well have something to do with the fact that the US was, right off the bat in March, said European travelers were not welcome in the US, right?
Right, right.
So I think it's reciprocal.
Right. Okay, then let's move on to how you suggested, to the questions from students. And on my list, I have first Shui Ting. Shui Ting, do you want me to read your questions? Do you want you? Okay, she wants me to read her questions. What challenges are global public relations facing right now?
What changes are global public relations facing right now? Well, COVID-19 is, when you say right now, if you are taking today,
yes,
I think COVID-19 has made a huge impact on our profession. Because, let me back up. Look at New Zealand. I think you have all observed over the past couple of weeks that New Zealand declared that it was COVID-19 free 2 weeks ago. But 5 or so days after that, there were 2 cases that were detected. Anyway, now look at the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She is a graduate of the communication department. So she has a degree in public relations. So would you say that her ability to communicate during this crisis had something to do with it? I certainly think so. And this is what many, many other analysts have also done. And so I think right now, public relations has certainly a huge task on its hand. And if you're interested, Xiaoting and others, what you can do is on the 3rd of July, we are having a live 2-hour kickoff of BLEDCOM. You may have heard of our International PR Symposium. It's in its 27th year, and for the first time, we will not be meeting in person in Bled, Slovenia for it. It's usually the first weekend of July. So we have a panel with one speaker from the US, from North America, one from Europe, one from Africa, and one from Asia, essentially discussing how the public relations industry has been affected by COVID-19. And we have the keynote speaker, Alice Clements from New Zealand, who has worked with UNICEF, etc. So the focus of this year's BLEDCOM, the annual conference, is going to be on how public relations is currently facing and tackling this huge crisis in COVID-19.
BLEDCOM is organized in Croatia, right?
No, it's in Slovenia.
Sorry,
Lake Bled is in Slovenia. It's always been there. That's why instead of calling it the International Public Relations Symposium, many people just have used the term BLEDCOM to refer to it. And so that's where it will be.
Right, right. I have seen recently that these discussions in the social sphere in the United States and these street movements, recent street movements, have provoked some changes, or at least the starting of discussions of more diversity in PR companies in the United States. Have you seen something like that?
Well, I've certainly been reading like you about it, but the question is whether we are actually seeing something in terms of the personnel. That may take a little bit of time. This again goes back to my earlier comment about ethnocentricity. Ethnocentricity in communication is also a result of ethnocentricity in the people who are doing the communicating, right? So if they are not diverse, then obviously there is not going to be diversity in the way this communication takes place. So I certainly think that the PR industry can improve a lot in terms of cultural relativism, being less ethnocentric, which basically means diversity. And it's not diversity of one or two ethnicities. It's basically diversity that's inclusive of global diversity, because we live in a globalized or globalizing world.
Let me move to the second question from Shweting. What does globalization mean for the practice of public relations? And what is the connection between economic globalization and public relations?
What's the connection between economic globalization?
Yes.
Okay. Now, are they reading the third edition of the book at all? Sorry?
Well, I have been giving them chapters, not the whole book. And we didn't have access to the latest edition. We are using second edition.
Well, I think you, the reason I ask is.
Yeah, I ordered the third edition through my department, but with everything being so delayed, I think my book is in my office, but they didn't allow us until this Monday to come back on campus.
Yeah. Well, I think, there are e-copies and so on, but I basically, the reason is we have got a chapter allocated to each of these, including, political economy. So in fact, I got a couple of political science professors to write a chapter on international politics and how it affects public relations. So that's one chapter. And then I'm part of the chapter on political economy. And then we have one on culture, which I have written, etc. etc. The reason I mentioned that is it goes to the question, which is mobilization. I mean, Sweting, how do you define mobilization? What did you have in mind when you asked this question?
I think globalization, like coronavirus, like a big problem that could be affect the whole world.
Yes, and we agree that something like this can affect the whole world. But I'm trying to get at what you mean by, I think your question was, Sorin, can you please repeat the question? It was on mobilization.
Not mobilization, globalization.
Can you repeat the question?
So what does globalization mean for the practice of public relations? What is the connection between economic globalization and public relations?
Ah, okay. Sorry, I heard it as mobilization. Okay. Oh, that's again an easy one. If you read the introduction of my third edition, we talk about it. Look, at least for the past 20 years, there have been three factors that have kind of affected globalization or that have been catalysts for globalization. The first, of course, is the collapsing of trade barriers, which began in the mid to late 1990s. So, you had the EU with the Maastricht Treaty, NAFTA, ASEAN, ASEM, etc. All of those trading blocs came into being in the final decade of the 1990s, of the 20th century. And this obviously led to countries trading not as individual countries, but as conglomerates. And this certainly affected communication and public relations. So that's the first factor. The second, of course, is the growth of satellite technology and the internet, as well as social media, all of which has happened in the last 20 odd years. And that certainly has affected globalization or created avenues for globalization. You can have a bright idea today and you can mobilize the entire world to pick up on that idea. How many of you are familiar, for example, with Kickstarter? Right? Are you familiar with Kickstarter? So if you have an idea, you go on Kickstarter, it's almost like crowdfunding, right? And if people like it and they back you up, and there are many such inventions that have taken off and they have made the inventor millionaires. So that's possible because of technology, including social media. So that's the second factor. And the third is, I think the world is coming together to deal with common problems, whether it is population or the environment, or now, a health crisis such as COVID-19. So when the world, except of course some outliers like North Korea and so on, when the world comes together, then they have to communicate. And these three factors have certainly been the purveyors of globalization in this time and space. I have written a chapter where I talk about this era of globalization. Many people, when they talk about globalization, they act as though globalization is new and that what we're experiencing now is the only time that globalization has occurred. Well, this is a different manifestation of globalization, but in a chapter I wrote in 2010, I talk about other eras of globalization, in the 17th century and so on. So globalization is certainly not new. And I think the other reference to economic globalization, of course, is, well, new markets have certainly given rise to this era of globalization. And the three factors that I mentioned to you now have a close relationship to economics, because the trading blocs were formed mainly because they wanted to have a larger market. For example, it's EU, instead of individual countries, you have a market of 450 million, right? And so on. And so a country like China, for example, has become a huge power, probably arguably the second largest economy in the world. And I think it's easy to see that it all happened only after 2002 when it became a member of the WTO. Right? So economic globalization has happened. Just look at, because of COVID, the disruption economically around the world in terms of movement of goods and services, production, etc. And I think COVID has given us a classic crucible to look at how we are so interconnected, not just physically, but economically as well. And I think public relations needs to take note of this, and a lot of this economic dependency in the world has to also do with communication. And that's where public relations does have a role.
Right. So if I can add something here to this question, you see, I've read recently the title of an article that read, "It's the end of convenience." It's because maybe the economic conditions with the real situation in which millions of people had to file for unemployment in the United States, business could not be done at the same speed and grandeur as it used to be. Now the transport of goods was not at the same pace, at the same level. So do you think maybe now we will assist, at least for a period of time, to a counter phenomenon, counter to globalization?
Well, don't forget that Brexit and Trump's election were pretty much on anti-globalization platforms. Right? So 2016 was a watershed moment in that respect. And the thing is, when globalization began, as I said, in 1992, 94, etc., I think it was in 1996 when the WTO met, I think, in Seattle. There were huge activist opposition. There was activist opposition to globalization because activists said that globalization and opening up markets helps the more powerful to overpower the less powerful countries of the world. And so initially, the opposition to globalization, especially economic globalization and trade, came from the developing world. It was in Africa or Asia and so on, because they felt that they simply didn't have the wherewithal to compete with the industrialized countries. But you see, the development of technology, which happened, in the early 2000s, kind of evened the playing field very quickly. And I go back to Tom Friedman's book, the world is flat, for example, as a case in point, and see how things changed. Whereas it was the developing countries that were opposed to globalization just 20 years ago, now you had nationalistic forces, whether it is in the UK or in the US, that were basically saying, globalization is bad. Trade, free trade is bad. That was a very different tune than 20 years ago when they all wanted it because they wanted to go to these new markets and, obviously expand. They were thinking in terms of broadening their market as opposed to what happened. So I think new media, social media, technology certainly changed the rules of the game. And so now you have this, argument that has been turned on its head.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to introduce this notion to my students too, but in the 18th century, there was an Italian writer called Giambattista Vico, who wrote about this theory that humankind's development goes in circles, but in like a spiral upwards. And it's always more ample, more amplified in positives and negatives. So do you think this theory is still valid? Because you see, there is an ebb and flow, globalization when the conditions are ripe and the politicians and the, global perception is positive to that, then it falls down. If the leadership pushed by the global perception are trying to pull it down, do you think that that kind of theory is still valid?
Well, you can use many analogies and many theories would be valid. I mean, you can say, well, it's the wheel, what goes up should come down, right? And so, or you can say, well, we are constantly developing, so the countries or ideologies that don't keep pace are going to be left behind.
Right.
And in a way, that argument can be made for technology, because the developing countries, whether it's India or China, we talk of BRICS, they were able to skip generations of innovation. So because we went away from the industrialized model of development into this new model, they were able to skip generations and very quickly catch up, right? Which is why in a matter of 2 decades, China was able to propel itself to being the second largest economy in the world. And depending on how you count things, it could very well be the largest economy also.
Okay, let me move then to the next question, which is from Brooke. Do you want to read your questions, Brooke?
I can. Do you want me to just read one for the sake of time, or do you want me to, and then if we have time at the end, we can come back?
Let's go for one.
Okay, that sounds good. So I'll just go with my second one, and it is, what is the most important skill that you think a PR practitioner should possess? Which I know that's kind of a loaded question, but if there was one skill that you could pick, what would it be?
You mean in a global setting?
Yes, sir.
So this is somebody who is practicing globally. Well, I would go with emotional intelligence. So I think as a communicator, whether you're in public relations or advertising or what have you, if you do not have emotional intelligence, I think you will not be able to succeed as a good communicator, because communication is about credibility. It's also about understanding, and I think emotional intelligence is wonderful because you are essentially trying to assess who you are as the communicator, who you are communicating with, and the context in which this communication is taking place. So somebody who has good emotional intelligence will be able to, situate the messaging as well as the communication, taking into account all of these. So knowledge of the self to me also means the ability to listen, because good communicators and people with good emotional intelligence are very good listeners. And if you listen well, then you are able to process that and then put out messages and information that will obviously be helpful to the recipient of the message. So I'll go with emotional intelligence.
Right. But I would argue that a practitioner being removed from his or her original culture, they can practice emotional intelligence only if they practice also empathy, backed up by some education about the local culture.
Yes, but Brooke gave me only one option. And I can easily argue that emotional intelligence would obviously also involve the things that you mentioned. Because you have to be emotionally linked to the situation. And that means even if you are in a new environment, you have to be aware of that environment, whether it's culture, political system, etc.
Right. Okay. Let's move on to a question of a person who is not present here, Ashley Cameron. She was asking, can you discuss the intersection of activism and public relations?
We have only 15 minutes. Absolutely. As I said earlier, take the case of China, for example, Kango, where I said, well, the activist organization engaged in this campaign. What's the fundamental activity of an activist group? Well, they're basically, how are they formed? They're formed because they find problematic something, whether it is within person, organization, a philosophy, value system, whether it is diversity. We are talking about that now with, the police, etc. So activists are formed because of a problem. And when they begin to find solutions to the problem very quickly, because they realize that larger numbers often mean more efficacy in getting the problem resolved to their satisfaction. So they engage in communication. So it's not enough if a small group of activists feels a certain issue is problematic. They try to broaden the base, and that involves communication. And if you go back to, for example, the situational theory of publics in public relations, very clearly, latent publics, aware, active publics. So, or issues management, you go back to Crable and Wibert's issue life cycle. At every stage, somebody who finds a situation problematic will try to communicate in order to either increase the number of people who are like-minded, thereby pressuring the origin of the problem and so on. So that's the role of public relations. As if you take communication as the primary function of public relations, then activist groups basically communicate. Either they communicate verbally or they communicate by action. And some of them take very radical action, that can often not be mainstream or acceptable to the mainstream population. But all of that is communication. So the link between activism and public relations is huge from that perspective. But if you take from the organization's perspective, the organization also has to contend with activist groups, especially corporations. Because, whether it's an environmental group that says, oh, you're polluting the river or you're polluting the air. And so they pressure, they go to the media, there are, stories. So organizations use public relations people in order to put their side of the story. So that's from the organization's perspective. So you can take it from both sides. Activist groups also use public relations and communication in order to propagate their values, their ideology, and their advocacy. And on the other hand, you have got organizations that have to contend with all of that. And so they use public relations to somehow counter it as well.
I remember very clearly the case of the Niger Delta pirates. 15, 20 years ago, they were fighting not only against their own government, but they were fighting on the foreign business of shell oil, because they were saying they had the right to fight for the resources of their own country that were polluting, and because of the money, their own military were protecting foreign entities in their own country.
Absolutely, it's a classic case study, which I think very few public relations books mention. It's the Ogoni tribe in the Niger Delta in Nigeria. They are less than 1 million, they are tribals. But because of the plentiful petroleum that's available there, outsiders have come and they have, profited. When I say outsiders, including within Nigeria, the government, etc., at the expense of the Ogoni. Petroleum is a very dirty commodity, to produce, to clean, etc. And so all the toxic waste has rendered their agricultural land useless. So they have nothing in which to grow. They're a small tribe, and so they're a minority. And yeah, that's a very tragic, in my view, case study of an activist group that had to resort, as I said earlier, the tactic, they had to resort to kidnapping, especially the executives from Shell, etc., the petroleum companies, because that was the only way, you know, kidnapping executives and bartering them for ransom was the only way they could make a living. And that's unfortunate because the government essentially gave up protecting their rights. So yeah, that's the Ogoni tribe.
Right. Oh, the same goes in some mineral-rich countries in South America, you know, in Chile and so on and so forth, Peru, where, you know, foreign interests have infiltrated the protection of their own citizens of the government. So the local governments, being weak to foreign interests, being bought over, usually they allow the foreign companies to do whatever and to do waste, to destroy the environment, to not pay well or give health care to the workers. So eventually the local population switches to activism and to even armed resistance.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there are plenty of such case studies you can take in Malaysia, you know, where an Australian company, I think way back in the early 2000s, came for rare earth minerals. And then you have got, you know, a whole movie was made, Blood Diamonds, in Africa, how the diamond industry has exploited the local population. Okay? And so on. So that, unfortunately, is a very sad state of affairs, but I think it continues, sad to say.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's move to another question. I think John Hines' turn has come. John, let's go with just one of the questions, right?
I'm right here. Just dropped my tablet. I had it in my hand, and then I dropped my tablet, but I've got it now. Okay, so let me just see which one we want here.
You decide.
Okay. I'm just gonna go. Let me see. Oh, I don't know. I'll just choose the first one. In your view, what are some of the most important issues worldwide, or the ones most worthy of activist intention? In other words, what all most needs to be changed that can be helped with public relations campaigns?
Okay, another very broad question that can keep us here for hours. But I think we just alluded to some of this, whether it is, you know, rare earth minerals in Malaysia, or the Ogoni tribe in Nigeria, or blood diamonds and so on. I think, as I said, that kind of exploitation continues. Even with COVID-19, you know, allegations were made that, you know, if you just read the newspapers, that China has been using COVID-19 as a way of leveraging its power around the world, you know, and so this thing continues. And so I think public relations has a role, as I said earlier, both by bringing to light such things, in other words, serving on the side of activist groups. And do remember, and I've said this to many undergraduates, you're all graduate students with years of experience, but, you know, 20 years ago, when I was teaching undergraduates, there was the sense that corporate public relations was the moneymaker. So if you go and work for corporations, that's the best place because that's where you will make the best salary, etc. And I've been reminding my undergraduates ever since that some of the best paying jobs these days come not just from corporations, but also from activist groups and governments, you know, governments around the world spend enormous sums of money to conduct campaigns. You know, United Nations, of course, it's an IGO, it's not a government as a national government. So I think public relations can represent both sides. They do represent both sides. And there are plenty of opportunities for public relations practitioners, young and old, to engage either on the side of activists or on the side of organizations, governments, etc.
Thank you.
Can't hear you, Soren. I think you're muted.
Sorry, I forgot I muted myself. I was asking Nicholas, can you ask one of your questions, or do you want me to read it? I saw that you were trying earlier to activate your sound.
Could you read the question? My Wi-Fi is not cooperating with me.
Okay. So I see here, let me ask the first one. Teaching public relations across the world, you have had the opportunity to influence the minds of those from different cultural backgrounds. Is there a common weakness noticed in new public relations practitioners?
Oh, that's a great question. One that needs some thinking. Now, I would, I'm obviously thinking on my feet here. I would kind of rephrase the question a little bit, if you permit me, Nicholas, as to say, well, how are new or young or first-time entry-level professionals being educated? So I think the primary problem that I have seen, teaching in 4 continents, especially with undergraduates, is that they're not essentially receiving as diverse a body of knowledge as is required for them to really be emotionally intelligent and practice globally. In other words, rather than talking about the deficiency of an individual practitioner, as your question seems to indicate, I would rather look at it from the training perspective. Being an educator, are we really training them to be kind of global communicators? And I go back to our textbooks and so on, even now, which tend to be quite ethnocentric, predominantly focusing on corporate public relations, not necessarily on government public relations, and certainly not on nonprofits and IGOs, to the extent that the focus should be there. If you take these 3 as the 3 big kinds of organizations, look at your basic PR textbooks and look at how many case studies there are from corporations, the so-called Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 companies, and how many case studies do we have from the other 2 types of organizations. In the ideal situation, from my perspective, it would be a third from each of those 3 large organizational, kind of types. And we don't see that. So I think students tend to be more focused on corporate public relations, but they may find themselves working in governments or IGOs or NGOs, and then they start thinking in terms of consumers and markets, and that's the language that they use. And I keep telling them, you're not talking to a market. If you're an NGO, they are not market. And then, social marketing, unfortunately, in public relations, we have not really focused very much on this notion of social marketing, as in doing social good. So social marketing is essentially the use of marketing philosophies and theories in order to do social good. And I think public relations as a field has not done a good enough job of embracing social marketing, which is very different from product or consumer marketing of products that corporations do. So I think that's one place where I find most entry-level practitioners to be deficient. And they tend to then try to learn on the job. And somehow we're all making it. But I think in the ideal situation, they would be much better prepared to also represent governments and nonprofits and IGOs.
I wanted to add to this question because it's talking about the fact that, how do we educate our first new entry-level PR practitioners? Do you think, for example, a week ago, we were talking to a professor who is at the University of Montpellier in France, and he was talking about the fact that in France, there is a whole history of resistance against cultural being culturally conquered by the American models. And they resist the vocabulary, they resist the practices, and they were talking about the fact that they are more interested in psychology being associated with the Public Relations Act than marketing that is tickling the needs and the pleasures of the consumers, but then it's not so ethical. It might be, like a forest fire. It gives you success for a short period of time, but it doesn't resist the test of time because usually it's just a bubble. So what do you think? There's a difference in the education starting from the same models of public relations then being put in different cultures around the world?
Yeah, well, I mean, I totally agree with that speaker, and it's not unlike what I've experienced teaching, in Europe since 2008, because I every year teach a course there. The thing is, and it's quite well known, that in Europe, many practitioners tend not to use the term public relations. They prefer the term communication management, strategic communication, corporate communication, etc., because they see public relations as a term that has originated in the US and that it has a certain mindset, a certain worldview that it brings, which they certainly don't feel that their culture, broadly European culture is ready to embrace, that kind of thing. So this goes back again to my common theme of ethnocentricity. And as I said, textbooks talk mostly about corporations, but they're also mostly based on Western, experiences. And here by Western experiences, I mean not just American experiences, but also Western European, a few Western developed countries, whether it's Germany or France or UK and so on. And the problem is that we know, and this is what we discuss in the Global PR Handbook, that political systems and political economy is very diverse in other continents, in other parts of the world. And if communication has to take place in those situations, then we have to train students to be able to have at least some knowledge to do that, which again goes back. I mean, look at your own course. Wherever I have taught global public relations, I have taught it, and I've taught it, as you know, from 4 continents. It's an elective. So only people who are interested in it can elect to take it. That's what an elective is. It's never mandatory. Now, why would you not want a course that deals with different political systems, different cultures, etc., to be mandatory to communication students? Should they not really learn about other cultures, other political ideologies, etc., in a way that will help them to integrate that into their communication patterns? So what we have here is self-selection. So people who have an orientation to international things or global things, for whatever reason, they elect to take this class. So the ones who are silent will continue to be silent and perhaps less informed. And the ones who are interested, obviously they're informed and they'll be better informed. So there is that divide, if you will, in the knowledge base itself.
Okay, okay. I think this is the last question with your permission, Dr. Sriramesh. I have here another question from a student who is not present at the discussion. Let me see which one is the best. When working in different countries, how can you ensure as a public relations practitioner that you are practicing in a way that doesn't offend their culture? We kind of touched on this.
Yeah, I guess that's been the theme of my talk for the past hour.
Yes.
Well, how can we do it? Just understand what their culture is. And this is what in response to Brooke's question, I said emotional intelligence. What is emotional intelligence? Well, one of the aspects of emotional intelligence is to have a better understanding of your surroundings. And by surroundings, it means culture in all its forms. So I think the hunger to understand where we are operating, is, I think, the answer to that question. That's the best solution. And I hope that has been the theme of this 1 hour's interaction. Cultural relativism, less ethnocentricity in everything that we do and the way we communicate.
Do you think linked to this, to me, from the practical examples that I have seen personally, that I have discussed with students in PRK studies classes, it's always the example of somebody coming from a culture that feels more entitled, like from the Western world, or let's say China, to a smaller nation. If somebody comes with, a PR practitioner comes with this kind of pre-installed in their head idea that they come from a superior culture, then their approach will be to not necessarily be empathetic. That's what I've seen. In Romania, for example, when I was doing 10 years ago my dissertation, well, in 2006, I was interviewing people in Bucharest from PR companies that were telling me that because there were, at the time of the Roman occupation of that area, 2,000 years ago, there were mines in the Carpathian Mountains. In the same area now, there was a company co-sponsored by Canadian companies and an Indian company, but they were trying to approach them through an Austrian public relations firm and forcing the local public relations companies to promote their business, to say that, these companies from Canada will come with cyanide and destroy 3 mountains, but in order to take the gold out of the mountains, and they will help the local population with jobs. They will even move their cemeteries somewhere else. They were trying so hard, but they were trying in a bullish way. Hey, you are a smaller culture. Hey, you are a smaller company. You listen to me. I'm bringing you money. The government will approve what we do. In the end, the activists put all their efforts together, and there were actors who were donating their time, and they made very dramatic representations of what it means to have this gold removed from the mountains. They were making a video in which they were very graphically pretending to pull their teeth out because it was gold, and say with blood on their mouth, "Look, foreign invaders, this is my gold, take it, but leave my mountains alone." So we are talking in theory about offering the professional this idea: be empathetic, be smart, read the local culture, and so on. But there's much more behind that. There's years of education, there's years of living in a certain system that sometimes makes you feel entitled. So how to fight that, how to counter that?
Well, here we can talk very briefly about what's the power of the public relations department or the function. Well, all the research from around the world tells us that public relations or the communication function in an organization is only as good as the power holders in the organizations want it to be. So if the power holders, the dominant coalition, the senior managers, want simply to use public relations as a window dressing, which tends to be the case, then that's what is going to happen. So because these are master's PR students, or they're interested in public relations, or undergraduates, we teach these things, you know, about being ethical, emotionally intelligent, etc. But the question is, we probably don't have as much autonomy to practice these things as we would like. So the question is then, do we just, you know, lay under the bus and let the bus ride over us, or do we then try, at least within the system, to advise senior managers and, you know, and there are instances where after constant communication and education by the communication department, senior managers have yielded and they have changed some of the organizational activities and worldviews and so on. But that's an uphill task, and that's one that we have to take. And if you, when you get the 3rd edition of the Global Handbook, I invite you to, especially for this reason, read chapter 8 from Ronald Rensburg, which basically is a case study of Bell Pottinger, the you know, the PR agency, the global PR agency in the UK, that did very unsavory, unethical, and immoral things, which led to its demise. But the question is that an aberration, or does it happen every time an agency does something like that? I tend to believe that Bell Pottinger, I'm glad it happened, the fall of Bell Pottinger, but it may not be, it may be an outlier that it happened, that somebody paid the price for being unethical and so on.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you know, money speaks. And so what you're referring to goes to that, the power of the public relations department, the will of the communication department, especially if they're agencies, to not yield because they are getting a £100,000 retainer every month or something of that sort.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you so much for your insight and for your very documented ideas. Do you have a question for my students?
Yes, I do. And they may have to unmute if they want to. They are all muted.
Sure.
What is your takeaway from this 1 hour talk? What struck you most?
Oh, okay. Well, I'll answer really quickly. We need to learn to be more open-minded and mentally flexible about other cultures, and we should try not to just take the things we've learned and just and make them assume that, you know, we should do things like we always have and be too powerful. But you know, I'm too inexperienced to really, you know, I've never worked in PR. I can't really apply this as like trying to imagine myself doing it. I don't think I would be powerful enough, you know, and I would not know what to support. I would just have to ask the people I was working with and for, you know, what should we be doing? So I can't really say what I could do in this if I were a practitioner.
Mm-hmm. That's fair enough.
I can go next. So for me, I've heard in a couple of classes the importance of emotional intelligence, especially from my management classes, because it's like 2 programs combined. And so especially like in the decision-making process and then when you're leading others, but I've never heard of emotional intelligence, of this aspect of it and how it's important for connecting with other cultures. Because when you think of emotional intelligence, you really just think of like self-reflection so you can lead other people, but not necessarily so you can connect with other people from different countries and understand them better. So the message that you're giving to them, telling to them, is in a method that they understand it, so they're not offended and everything like that. So I thought that that was what stuck out the most to me.
Great. And just to add to that, Brooke, it's not only understanding other cultures in order to give them a message. Keep in mind that emotional intelligence will also make you change the message.
That's true.
So when you listen, then you also, somebody who has good emotional intelligence will not only be trying to persuade, but will also be willing to be persuaded based on that listening.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very key ingredient also, which perhaps you won't learn in marketing because they have a single orientation. And their orientation is to sell the product, is to sell the companies. So, and I think that would make you, and that context would make you less of an emotionally intelligent person than it would in this case, where you're using it to communicate. And communication is not only to disseminate information, but it's also to receive information that potentially could change you as well.
Yeah.
You're not only trying to change the other.
I like that. Thank you.
Shui-Ting?
I think this hours is very useful to me because I only know a little bit PR about this course before I learning this course, because in China I only listen to my professor mention about PR based on the West public relations and some very like Western culture or some Chinese culture, but we are ignoring some small culture. I think it's very useful to me, and more about knowledge about the PR.
Great, great. Okay.
Okay. Nicholas?
Yeah, I agree with everybody. Like, they pointed out some really key thoughts that I was feeling as well. But I feel your answer to my question was spot on, because I feel like that's a common theme in most professions, that there's not a diverse knowledge base going into that profession. And that was just you know, very interesting to me.
Great, good.
Okay. Well, thank you again very, very much, Dr. Sriramesh, and thank you to the students that made the time to be present.
Great. Thank you all. It's been a fantastic 75 minutes for me, and I wish you all good luck in your pursuits, whether it is in public relations or another field. I hope that regardless of which field you pursue, that you'll be better communicators.
Thank you.
So much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Nice weekend.
Have a good summer.
Bye.
Bye.